What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we've got our Week 16 NFL game picks outright versus the spread, along with our locks of the week. If you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, and also give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us as we get closer to kickoff and see our thoughts on these games. And better yet, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for a free newsletter to get access to these games early on in the week. All those details in the description. But for now, let's get right into it. Before getting into our breakdowns, I want to give you guys a quick word from our sponsors at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who are taking DFS to a whole nother level. And I specifically want to highlight their matchup shop function, which is an absolute blast. In fact, we've been using it since the start of the NFL season because, let's face it, betting on the same old Team A versus Team B can get a little bit stale, a little bit boring. Well, that's not even close to being the case with the matchup shop of Overlay Fantasy, as it allows you to bet on individual player matchups, and it's super simple. Just pick whichever player you think will have the higher fantasy performance. And just like a regular bet would work, check out the spreads, do your research, and then win some money. You can bet on pretty much any single sport that you want, whether it's NFL, golf, MLB, etc. All those options are there. And again, super simple. Pretty much for any single NFL game coming up, you've got a bunch of different matchups that are always updated and added to. So if it's something as simple as just putting a single submission, you can do that. But guess what? If you want to get a parlay going and double up some of those winnings, you can do that as well. So take advantage of this. All of that homework you're doing for your fantasy lineups, let's have that translate to some big time winnings for your wallet as well. So do yourself a favor and check out Overlay Fantasy's matchup shop now. Our first game of the week featured the Minnesota Vikings at the New Orleans Saints on Thursday night. The Vikings 6-8 after losing to the Bears, while the New Orleans Saints 10-4 after losing to the Kansas City Chiefs. And if you guys follow us on Twitter at AllDayPigskin, or better yet, are signed up for our newsletter at alldaypigskin.com, you get access to these picks early on in the week, and you knew that we like the Saints here across the board. Simply put, the Saints had a lot to play for here, and even with Michael Thomas being out for the rest of the regular season, they had a great matchup versus, simply put, a bad Minnesota Vikings defense. So even though we had seen this Saints offense struggle with Michael Thomas before, we knew that they would have success versus the Vikings, at least in a vacuum for this week. That is exactly what happened. And as we predicted, Alvin Kamara had a huge part in this offense. He absolutely ran wild on the Vikings. And at the end of the day, even though the Vikings did have some success because they've got, a great trio of their own in Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, and Justin Jefferson, that New Orleans Saints defense was just too good, and the offense jumped out to too big of a lead too quickly for the Minnesota Vikings to ever get back in it. So all things considered, we start the week out at 2-0. Looking at Saturday, we start with the Tampa Bay Bucks at the Detroit Lions, the first of our doubleheader, where the Bucks are 9-5 after their come-from-behind victory over the Atlanta Falcons, whereas the Detroit Lions 5-9 after losing to the Tennessee Titans. And we'll more so focus on the Bucks here because they are the better team. They've got the better record to prove it, and they are seemingly playoff bound, whereas we can't quite say the same thing for the Detroit Lions. I mean, in a couple of months, they could look very different offensively, especially at the quarterback position, but that is a conversation for another time. Getting back to the Bucks here, who, like we said, are the better team with the better record, we do want to shed some light on them because they are far from perfect, despite the fact that, they might have one of the best offensive rosters in the NFL, and Tom Brady might have some of the best weapons at running back, wide receiver, and tight end. It hasn't necessarily translated because we've seen it this last month, hell, longer than that, and even last week, they've had serious issues when it comes to slow starts offensively. Now, sure, maybe a date with the Detroit defense is exactly what they need to get back on track, as they should be able to at least run all over the Detroit Lions, who have been giving up some pretty big games to the running back position as of late, and honestly pretty much since the start of the year. And regardless if the Bucs have Ronald Jones or not, they've got some great backups there in Leonard Fournette and LaShawn McCoy that should be able to get the job done. So to me, the translation here is this might be one of those rare weeks where we finally see the Bucs kind of just clicking on all cylinders and operating to the potential that we thought they might at the start of this year. And I do think that's, bad luck for the Detroit Lions, who I guess silver lining, they should have Matthew Stafford available to them, which should prevent this game from being a total blowout. But even with all these factors and the Bucs' lack of offensive consistency, they're, like we said, still the better team pretty much from top to bottom. So for that reason, I don't think there's any reason to get cute here. Let's go with the Bucs outright. The spread is where it gets maybe a little bit tricky because I could see a scenario where the Bucs take their foot off the gas pedal. And with Matthew Stafford, who isn't afraid to sling the football, maybe there's some garbage time points. And right now, the Lions are getting plus 8.5. I actually think that's good value. If that number gets even higher, I'd be jumping on the Lions on the spread. But as of right now, my personal preference would be just mainly to take the Bucs outright and then stay away from the spread. But if you have to, go with the Detroit Lions where you're probably getting some better value. Next up, our second Saturday game features the San Francisco 49ers at the Arizona Cardinals. The 49ers are 5-9 after losing to the Cowboys, while the Cardinals 8-6 after sweating out a victory over the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the first time these two teams played was all the way back in Week 1, where the Cardinals got a narrow win, but honestly, things have certainly changed since then. Unfortunately, those changes probably won't be making this game any more competitive, as the 49ers right now are going to be down to their third string quarterback, along with having a plethora of other offensive and defensive injuries. The lone bright spot is that they should have George Kittle back, but I could see him being on a snap count. I could see him just being there maybe as a decoy. And with the quarterback situation being what it is for the 49ers, I'm not all that confident that he would have as big of an impact on this game as he might normally. And that's not to say that this game will be a blowout, as we know that these NFC West divisional games, you almost have to disregard the record, as it's always a grind-out battle. But again, even with that in mind, it's tough for us to go against the Cardinals here, as they've got the decisive offensive advantage. And sure, the Arizona defense is, kind of another story, but right now we just don't believe that the 49ers have the talent at quarterback to take advantage of that. So for that reason, we are going to take the Cardinals outright and are also leaning that way on the spread, as they're just kind of catching the 49ers at an opportune time. That number at -4.5, you may be better off kind of teasing that number down to -2.5, something like that. But either way, we are going the way of the Cardinals here. Moving on, we've got the Miami Dolphins at the Las Vegas Raiders. The Dolphins 9-5 here after grinding out a victory over the Patriots, while the Raiders are 7-7 after losing to the Chargers. And unfortunately for the Raiders, after that loss, they've been all but eliminated from the playoffs. Technically, they've still got some slim hopes alive, and for what it's worth, the return of Derek Carr should help at least a little bit. But unfortunately for the Raiders, we do think the good news ends there, as this Miami team is going to be a tough defensive matchup. And on the flip side, this Miami offense should be able to take advantage of, let's be honest, a shaky Raiders defense. And offensively for the Raiders, the reason we are a bit skeptical of them is that, first and foremost, we don't see Josh Jacobs having major success versus Miami. And if you look at some of the more impressive games that the Raiders have been a part of, Josh Jacobs has been a focal point. But if that doesn't happen, basically, this offense becomes just a bit too predictable. And even with a weapon like Darren Waller, which, translation, it becomes tough sledding. And then for the Dolphins, this is one of those seemingly perfect matchups, as Tua shouldn't have to do all that much, and he's probably going to be helped by his defense. So for that reason, we're going to take the Dolphins outright, and on the spread where the Raiders are at +2.5, I believe that number should be higher, and honestly, the Raiders have just been one of those teams all year long where the talent hasn't necessarily been as good as the record. So for that reason, we are going Miami outright and on the spread. Next up, we got the Atlanta Falcons at the Kansas City Chiefs. The Falcons 4-10 after yet another blown lead, this time versus the Bucs, while the Chiefs 13-1 after outlasting the New Orleans Saints. And forgive us if you've heard this before, but I feel like when discussing the Falcons, we need to start with what's become almost a customary statement, and that is as follows. The Atlanta Falcons and Matt Ryan are not as good, not even close, without Julio Jones offensively. And guess what? Shocker, just kidding, Julio is not expected to play here. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the Falcons will be without one of their top weapons versus an elite team in the Kansas City Chiefs. And sure, don't get us wrong, the Falcons still have some great offensive pieces. Calvin Ridley has been sensational, but they're just not built for a game where they have to keep pace with an elite offense, as they simply aren't efficient enough offensively. And it's been an issue all season long, honestly, even with Julio Jones. And maybe it's been a combination of things. You know, the rushing attack just not being there, the offensive line not protecting Matt Ryan sufficiently, or Matt Ryan just making some bad mistakes, and at the end of the day, the defense not helping out anybody. Either way, the Falcons have fallen short of expectations, and the Chiefs right now, they're not going to, let the Falcons get away with that, because they are out for blood, and they're going to put up about 30 points on you in their sleep. I think that's going to be the case here versus the Falcons. And in situations where the Falcons go down, and they go down big, quick, that's when it gets the worst for them. That's when Matt Ryan, becomes very predictable, and that's when he starts to make mistakes, and that's when the Falcons just continue to dig that hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And you know what? You guessed it. We're taking the Chiefs here outright. The spread is at minus 10.5. Honestly, I feel like that number should be bigger, and with Julio Jones out, I feel like that's almost a lock as well. So go with the Chiefs there too. Continuing on, we've got the Chicago Bears at the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Bears 7-7 after beating the Vikings last week, while the Jaguars 1-13 after losing to the Ravens. And here we'll mostly focus on the Bears, as they've technically got some slim playoff hopes live, even though, they're probably on life support, whereas the Jaguars, well, they've got a foot out of the door, and who can blame them after being gifted an opportunity last week to potentially land Trevor Lawrence in this upcoming NFL draft? So that's your silver lining here if you're a Jaguars fan. That's all you need to know. But as far as the matchup itself is concerned, the Bears are doing what they should be, and that is taking advantage of the easy part of their schedule. Because this last month, and this week included, they're facing some of the worst, and I mean the worst NFL defenses available. And for them, unfortunately, it's probably a situation of too little too late. Because sure, things look great when you're facing the bottom of the barrel competition, but in other scenarios, well, that's when that glass slipper falls off. Mitch Trubisky returns to looking like a bust. David Montgomery can't carry the load. The offensive line looks questionable. And Matt Nagy is a head coach that you don't have all that much trust in. But hey, good news. For this week at least, the Bears should be fine. And honestly, we like them for betting purposes as a lock outright. Because, like we alluded to, the Jaguars have an awful defense. They've got question marks at the quarterback position. They're a little bit banged up offensively. The Bears have a really good defense. And game plan-wise, David Montgomery can do the heavy lifting. Trubisky doesn't have to be the guy that wins you the football game. And the Bears defense will, put the finishing touches on this game. All of that translates to a Bears victory. The spread, only plus 7.5. We think that's relatively low, honestly, as far as the Jaguars are concerned. So we're actually hammering the Bears outright and on the spread. Moving on, we've got the Cincinnati Bengals at the Houston Texans. The Bengals 3-10-1 after beating the Steelers in one of the biggest upsets of the year, and it would have been the biggest one if it wasn't for what the Jets did last week, while the Texans 4-10 after narrowly losing to the Colts yet again. And getting back to the Bengals here, look, maybe it was that change at quarterback or just catching the Steelers at the right time. Either way, kudos to them because they led from start to finish. Unfortunately, we don't see it happening again versus the Texans. And look, it's not to say that the Texans are an elite team, but right now they are at least capable offensively, and they've got a quarterback that will, for the most part, keep his team in the game. And it does help that Deshaun Watson has got a favorable defensive matchup here. But watch out for this, because the Texans, not to be outdone, might have an even worse defense. And that's why we think this might be one of those sneaky, high-scoring, competitive, and actually really entertaining games on the week. While we do like the Texans outright, we're not going to get too cute here because they've got the much better quarterback, the better scoring offense. Watch out for the Bengals on the spread, because right now the Texans are at -9.5. And with how bad that defense is, I wouldn't be trusting the Texans to cover that number, because they've also got an atrocious rush defense. And if the Bengals can have some success on the ground, that should help them bring some balance to this offense and keep them in the game. So for that reason, even though we like the Texans outright, we actually think with the Bengals almost getting double digits as underdogs, they present great value on the spread, and we are hammering them there. Next up, we've got the Cleveland Browns at the New York Jets. The Browns, 10-4, took out the New York Giants last week. Simple enough. But on the other hand, you have got the one, the only, the New York Jets, who are officially at 1-13. No longer that goose egg in the win column, coming up the biggest upset of the year by beating the Rams. And yes, hand up, we picked the Rams as a lock over the Jets last week. But okay, we were wrong. But guess what? So was pretty much every single other analyst in America. And unfortunately for the Jets, if you're a fan, even when you win, you lose. And obviously here we're alluding to the NFL draft and the opportunity to select Trevor Lawrence with the 101, or I should say the former opportunity to select Trevor Lawrence, because right now the Jaguars have the lead in that department. But again, that's a conversation for another time once we start breaking down NFL mock drafts closer to that time. Getting back to this actual matchup, the Browns should be the team you pick. Don't let last week dissuade you from picking the better team. Don't get cute and all of a sudden start to pick the Jets as a trendy upset pick. The Browns are the better team. They've got the rushing attack in place to prevent a Jared Goff type of meltdown from Baker Mayfield. So outright, the Browns, again, you should go with them there. The spread is where, you can have a conversation, because the Jets are at +9.5. And the real X factor here is the Browns defense, because we've seen scenarios where they show up and the Browns trend to a decisive victory, but we've also seen situations where teams can score on them, plain and simple. So depending on what version of that team shows up, what you have faith in, and considering that the opponent is the Jets, and yes, I realize they've had some success scoring offensively as of late, but I'm going to treat that as a blip, as an anomaly, not as a trend. And I will give the benefit of the doubt to that Cleveland Browns defense and say that they will put together a whole team effort and come away with a decisive win here. So you guessed it, we're going with the Browns outright, which is the chalk pick, but then also the Browns on the spread to cover that 9.5 number that the Jets are getting. Next up, we've got the Indianapolis Colts at the Pittsburgh Steelers. One of the marquee games of the week. The Colts are at 10-4 after beating the Texans, while the Steelers 11-3, shockingly losing to the Bengals, and also shockingly on a 3-game losing streak. But looking past that, this is probably a game that seemed a lot easier to predict a couple of weeks ago, but now all of a sudden, not so much the case. And the primary reason for that is that the Steelers are A, banged up defensively, B, they look lost offensively where the rushing attack is non-existent, and then also, all of a sudden, Big Ben is struggling. While on the flip side, the Colts are excelling in the rushing attack, and Phillip Rivers finally looks comfortable in this Indianapolis offense. Yes, we thought it would happen sooner, but guess what? Better late than never. And that's not to say that it's impossible for Rivers to all of a sudden implode versus a still very good defense for the Pittsburgh Steelers, which at the end of the day is why this game is so close to a coin flip in our eyes. In all honesty, we want to go with the Steelers, as it's difficult to see them go on a 4-game losing streak, but we just can't ignore all the issues they're currently having. And maybe this is the week where they get back to executing offensively, but there's been no signs to indicate that this type of turnaround is coming this last month. So for that reason, we will go with the team that's playing better offensively, that's doing well in the rushing attack, that's got a good offensive line, that's got a quarterback that isn't making some of those mistakes, in a defense that's also very balanced. For that reason, we're going with the Colts here. But again, you could say a lot of those same things for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So if you guys honestly want to avoid this game, we don't blame you. That might be the best thing to do here. Right now, the Steelers are favored at -2.5. And just because this should be, again, a very close game, I think the Colts from that perspective give you better value. So I will go with the underdogs here and ride with the Colts outright and on the spread. Next up, we've got the New York Giants at the Baltimore Ravens. The Giants 5-9 after losing to the Browns, while the Ravens 9-5 after thoroughly beating the Jaguars. And the big storyline here is that the Giants are expected to get Daniel Jones back. But even with that, we're not going to get too excited about the chances of the Giants pulling off an upset. And yes, this offense is unquestionably better with Jones under center. But guess what? They still have some of the same issues that they had last week and the week before, and that is an inconsistent offensive line and a turnover-prone quarterback. And on the flip side, the Ravens, they're on a bit of a roll. Lamar Jackson is showing flashes of his MVP self from last year, and the team as a whole is slowly getting healthier. Now, yes, undoubtedly, a lot of this offensive success for the Ravens has been due to the fact that they faced some subpar and inconsistent defenses, but again, all you can do is play the opponents on your schedule. And the Giants' defense may be on the other side of the equation. They're tough, but we tend to believe that Lamar will be able to wear them down, and that this game breaks open as it progresses. So for that reason, and the fact that we just don't believe that Daniel Jones is truly healthy right now, we have to go with the Baltimore Ravens. Daniel Jones at less than 100% means this offense will be limited. The Ravens outright seem like a lock. The spread here is where you should be focusing on, because the Ravens are at -11.5. That's a big number. But if our assumption about Daniel Jones and his health is true, then the Ravens on the spread seem like the pick to make as well. Next up, we've got the Denver Broncos at the LA Chargers, a divisional clash between two 5-9 teams. The Broncos coming off a loss to the Bills, whereas the Chargers, nice overtime win versus the Raiders. And this is actually a rematch of a game that happened earlier in the year where, shocker, the Chargers suffered a heartbreaking loss. But look, all joking aside, we actually do think the Chargers are the better team on paper. You know, the one area where that has kind of changed as the week has progressed is some offensive firepower in the form of Hunter Henry being placed on the COVID IR list. So the Chargers are down their starting tight end, and then Keenan Allen being a game time decision. However, we still do believe the Chargers, for the most part, have the slight edge offensively, and it does come to the play at the quarterback position. Justin Herbert, edge over Drew Lock. But let's not count out the Denver Broncos either, because even though they don't do a lot of scoring of their own, you know, only a handful of games where they've gone above 25, 30 points, one of those teams they did it versus was the Chargers earlier this year. So what I'm trying to say is versus a defense similar to their own, where it's not all that, you know, intimidating. It's got some nice pieces, sure, but it does let up a lot of points. They could have some success here. But ultimately, at the end of the day, some silver lining for the Chargers and why we still like them to win this game outright. You know, this isn't too dissimilar from what we saw versus the Raiders last week. That was a game where Keenan Allen, mostly a decoy, same with Mike Williams. Sure, Hunter Henry was present. But on the flip side, look, Austin Eckler will be healthier. So will Mike Williams, hopefully. And for that reason, I think it's pretty close in terms of what Justin Herbert will have to work with here versus the Broncos. So with all that being said, I am still leaning the Chargers outright. The one way this has changed for me is in terms of betting the spread, where the Chargers were at -3.5. But with this being the situation and, that gap being closed between these two offenses, I will switch that pick to the Denver Broncos. I believe this will be a classic Chargers game where they really make you sweat this one out. If they win, it's going to be very close, by 2-3 points, something like that. So for that reason, Chargers outright, but the Broncos on the spread. Next up, we got the Carolina Panthers at the Washington Football Team. The Panthers 4-10 after losing to the Packers, while Washington 6-8 after their loss to the Seattle Seahawks. And we have gone back and forth on this game, and we have determined that we're pretty much leaning fully depending on the status of Alex Smith for Washington at the quarterback position. If Alex Smith plays, we feel a lot better about Washington's chances to win here, as opposed to if he wasn't available and it was the Dwayne Haskins show. Because simply put, Alex Smith has been the best quarterback for Washington since day one that's been available on their roster. He isn't all that flashy, and this offense still has limitations scoring-wise, but out of that entire quarterback room, Kyle Allen and Dwayne Haskins, he's the most experienced. He is the least erratic, and he also does a very good job of taking care of the football. And those things count in close games, which is the style of football that Washington plays. Now, also something to monitor here is the status of Terry McLaurin. Right now it's looking doubtful that he will play, so that is a big loss for them, their stud wide receiver. We might see Antonio Gibson back at the running back position offensively, so that might be somewhat of a trade-off, but I would have my reservations about him, as this would be his first game back from a turf toe injury, and that usually lingers a little bit, so keep that in mind. The other X factor here, honestly, is going to be the Panthers facing former head coach in Ron Rivera. There's nobody that knows this Panthers team and their strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion, as well as Ron Rivera. And you better believe that he is going to have his Washington squad ready for that and prepared to take advantage of those opportunities. So, in my opinion, if Alex Smith plays, partnered with the familiarity that Ron Rivera has versus this Panthers team, Washington wins this game. Now, I know what you're saying. The Panthers, offensively, they have a lot more weapons, and I would agree. Teddy Bridgewater has the edge at the quarterback position. They've got the edge at the wide receiver position as well, with Robbie Anderson, with DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel. Christian McCaffrey isn't expected to play here again, so we can call the running back position a wash, but still some very important skill positions. The Panthers hold the advantage. But on the flip side, they're facing a very good Washington defense. So I expect them to be limited here scoring-wise. I could see a low-scoring game here in general. That's usually the case with matchups that Washington is involved in. So right now, this is the way we're going. If Alex Smith plays, go with Washington fully, outright and on the spread, which is right now at -2.5 for Washington. And I feel like that is low enough where you can take Washington pretty much as a pick 'em. If Alex Smith doesn't play, then I would definitely be going with the Panthers on the spread. I think they've got some good value there. And then outright becomes a lot more questionable. So here, really, the storyline that needs to be followed is the status of one Alex Smith. Next up, we got the Philadelphia Eagles at the Dallas Cowboys, divisional clash in the NFC East. The Eagles 4-9-1 after a tough loss versus the Cardinals. Great performance from Jalen Hurts, while the Cowboys 5-9, victorious over the 49ers. And against all odds, every single team in the NFC East is currently alive to win this division, even though it's week 16. That is absolutely insane. That's why this game is so important here. Now, for the Eagles, ever since they went with Jalen Hurts as their starting quarterback, that's kind of reinvigorated this team. Maybe you can make the case that they faced a squad in the Cardinals last week where defensively they were letting up a lot of points. So That's not something that necessarily would translate every single week in terms of offensive success for the Eagles if you extrapolate that performance. But guess what? This Dallas Cowboys defense, it ain't anything to write home about either. And that's the big deal here. For the Dallas Cowboys, well, it's going to come down to Andy Dalton. We fully believe that, because if Dalton can put together a good game where he limits his mistakes and keeps the score close, then the Cowboys can absolutely pull off the upset. While the status of Ezekiel Elliott is up in the air, it doesn't really matter. Tony Pollard has proven once again that he is more than capable in terms of backing up Zeke. So we don't expect the Dallas rushing attack to be the issue here. With all those things in mind, we're going to look at the Philadelphia defense as the potential X factor in this game on the Philly side of things. Right now, we tend to give them the edge as far as positional groups are concerned. And if they can hold Dallas to right around 20 points, we feel good about the Eagles' chances to win. With a dual threat quarterback in Jalen Hurts, that's definitely more versatile than Andy Dalton. That opens things up offensively for the Eagles. And with their advantage defensively, we like them to win a close game here. Right now, the spread practically a pick 'em at plus 1.5. So for that reason, we are going with the Eagles outright and on the spread. Continuing on, we've got the LA Rams at the Seattle Seahawks, another great divisional clash in the NFC West. The Rams 9-5, coming off, bar none, the worst loss this year after being beaten by the Jets last week. While Seattle 10-4 grinded out a victory versus Washington last week. And even though right now it probably seems like a slam dunk picking Seattle, again, especially after what we saw from the Rams last week, we would say slow your roll, because let's not forget that the first time these two teams played, the Rams actually won. And they did a really good job of limiting Russell Wilson and some of those top weapons for Seattle, including DK Metcalf. And lastly, these divisional clashes, specifically in the NFC West, get that record out of there. It is normally a toss-up with a lot of upsets. But even with that said, we do expect Seattle to win here and even this series. Yes, the Rams have a good defense, better than that of Seattle. And again, they did one of the best jobs of the entire year stopping Seattle offensively last time. But we have a hard time imagining that it happens twice versus the caliber of quarterback that Russell Wilson is. So we just want to be clear. We're not predicting a blowout by any means, but Seattle is simply the team we trust more at this point. Last week was the perfect example of how inconsistent Jared Goff can be, and that this Rams offense truly goes as he does. This Seattle defense should be a positive matchup for the Rams, but at the end of the day, we have more faith in Wilson over Goff in a close matchup, and that is the deciding factor in this game. We're going Seattle outright on the spread, practically a pick'em. Seattle at minus 1.5, so we're going with the Seahawks on the spread too. Looking at Sunday night, we have got the Tennessee Titans at the Green Bay Packers. This should be a good one. The Titans 10-4 after beating the Lions, while the Packers 11-3 after beating the Panthers this last week. And this is a game with huge playoff implications for both sides. The Titans, well, they need to keep pace with the Colts for first place in their division, while the Packers need to stay a game ahead of the Saints for the number 1 seed in the NFC. And funny enough, both these teams kind of do similar things well and not so well in terms of having high-octane offenses and, suspect defenses. We'll put it that way. Now, sure, the Packers have the better quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, who's playing at an MVP level, and they have got a stud wide receiver in Devontae Adams. But the Titans offensively might have a little bit more depth. They've got the more dangerous rushing attack with Derrick Henry and how he's used. Also, the better matchup there versus this bad Packers rush defense. While the Packers, Aaron Jones is great as well, but the committee he's in with Jamal Williams, I believe, takes away a little bit from that tempo and that rushing attack as a whole. While the wide receivers, again, A.J. Brown is a great wide receiver for the Titans. Not quite as big of a name as Devontae Adams, but when you pair him up with Corey Davis, I would go with that wide receiver core for the Titans, probably more so. And when all those pieces are clicking, that's when Ryan Tannehill is a serious threat. So due to this, it wouldn't be a shock if this is one of the highest scoring games of the week with a bunch of lead changes and a really tight finish. The game plan for the Titans: utilize Derrick Henry. A lot of their success these last couple of weeks has been due to that, and I don't anticipate them getting away from that. For the Green Bay Packers, it'll be Aaron Rodgers, it'll be Devontae Adams. That's been the way they have gotten things done. So when things are this close, we look at the small differences. And one of those could be the familiarity Matt LaFleur has with this Titans group. And that definitely exists, so maybe you could say small advantage there, if any, for the Green Bay Packers. But one area where there could be a decisive advantage is the kicking position, because Mason Crosby has been sensational for Green Bay all season long, while we can't say the same for Gostkowski. And if it does come down to a 2-3 point type of margin here, and it comes down to the kickers, well, we've got more faith in the Green Bay Packers. So when looking at this entire thing from that perspective, we're going to go with the Packers outright. We think it'll be really close, really competitive, and a very entertaining game in general. As far as the spread is concerned, right now the Packers at -3.5. I'm going back to what I said. This should be a very close game. This Packers defense, not elite. I like the Titans to stay in this contest. So on the spread, I really like Tennessee. And finally, getting to Monday Night Football, we've got the Buffalo Bills at the New England Patriots. The Bills 11-3 after beating the Denver Broncos, while the New England Patriots 6-8 after losing to the Miami Dolphins. So the Patriots have been eliminated from the playoffs, while the Bills, looking at them, they've got an MVP candidate on their offense in Josh Allen. And you could argue that the Bills got lucky in winning this first matchup versus the Patriots, but let's be honest, they are the better team without question. Their offense is loaded with talent, and Josh Allen looks like a young Cam Newton as he's dominating through the air and on the ground. And while it's true that the Patriots did a good job of slowing down this offense the first time around, now they will be without arguably their best defender in Stephon Gilmore, and that will have a huge impact versus a loaded Bills wide receiver group. Also, considering that the Patriots have nothing to play for this time, we wouldn't be shocked to see them focused on draft capital to close out the season, as they will seemingly need rebuilding help moving forward. For us, the only question right now seems to be the spread at +6.5 for New England. But with how troubling this Patriot offense has been as of late, especially spreading out the football through the air, we have to give the advantage to the Bills there. So for that reason, we like the Bills outright and on the spread. So with that, we wrap up our pick'ems. Now looking at our locks of the week, we start with the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Atlanta Falcons. No Julio Jones for the Falcons. This entire offense is different without him, and going up versus an offensive juggernaut, it is a done deal. Give us the Chiefs here as they take advantage of this bad Atlanta Falcons team. Next up, Chicago at the Jaguars. This is a great matchup for the Chicago Bears. The Jaguars, bad defense all around, and offensively, they've got question marks. We expect a big game from David Montgomery and the Chicago defense as they get the victory there. Moving on, Cincinnati at Houston. Give us the Houston Texans here. We think this is a good matchup for them versus this Cincinnati Bengals defense. And even though, the Bengals offense has a good matchup as well, we just don't see them keeping up pace with Deshaun Watson. So we like the Texans. Next up, Cleveland at the New York Jets. Great win for the Jets last week, but probably not really if you're considering draft capital. But we are not expecting lightning to strike twice. Give us the Browns here as they probably run all over the Jets. And then finally, the Baltimore Ravens versus the New York Giants. Give us the Baltimore Ravens here. Daniel Jones, not 100%. Even if he plays, Lamar Jackson will wear down this defense. We like the Ravens to get this victory. So with that, we wrap up our Week 16 NFL game picks and locks. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have? We will do our best to answer them. If you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to keep up with us and our thoughts on these games and other things NFL. as we get closer to kickoff. And also check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for our free newsletter to get access to these games earlier on in the week. All those details in the description. But for now, we'll see you guys in future videos.